Did you know that before they made video and arcade games, Sega made slot machines? From 1940 until around 1965, Sega was involved in the refurbishing, manufacturing, and sale of slot machines. Sega is known for being a Japanese company, except that's not really accurate. Sega was founded as Standard Games in 1940 by three American businessmen, Martin Bromley, Irving Bromberg, and James Hupert. The name itself isn't Japanese. It's actually a reference to one of the first iterations of the company. Service Games was established in 1946, and the name was a reference to the fact that Sega sold games to U.S. Army bases. The name Sega was an abbreviation of Service Games and first appeared on a 1954 slot machine. Among Sega's first products, a jukebox. It produced Japan's first domestic jukebox, the Sega 1000, in 1960. Sega didn't get into the arcade business until 1968 when it created Periscope, an electromechanical submarine shooter. The game was a surprise hit for Sega, which went on to produce more games. Those games included Sega's first video-based games, Pongtron. When Pongtron was a hit, Sega began its formal pivot to arcade games. At one point in the 1980s, Sega was one of the top 5 manufacturers of arcade games in the world. Sega would be a leader in the arcade industry. Among their innovations, Hang On, a motorcycle game that was one of the first motion-based, commercially successful arcade games. 5 years later, Sega produced the world's first 360-degree spinning arcade machine called the R60. The R was short for rotate, and the cabinet could move 360 degrees, potentially leaving the player upside down. For most of us, the Genesis was our first Sega system. That being said, it actually wasn't the first video game system that Sega produced. Prior to the Genesis, Sega produced the SG-1000, the SG-1002, and the Master System. Combined, the three units sold between 11 and 15 million copies. While the Master System stopped production in most of the world between 1991 and 1994, the thing is still being sold in Brazil, where it remains one of the most popular systems available. The system's continued production makes it one of the longest continuing video game systems of all time. Before turning to home consoles, Sega tried its luck with computers. The SG-3000 was very similar to Sega's first efforts in the console market. It came with a built-in keyboard and had additional room for other hardware expansions. Sega's fourth video game system was the Genesis, which came out worldwide between 1988 and 1990. The system was not an instant hit and sold 500,000 units in its first year, just half of the goal of Sega at the time. In its initial iteration, Sonic was not the first Pac-Man game. That was Altered Beast. Altered Beast is a beat-em-up game, where you take the forms of various animals in order to rescue Athena, daughter of Zeus. There were ultimately 3 models of the original Sega Genesis. The 3 models had very significant differences in terms of design, configurations, internal hardware, and more. Of course, it goes without saying that Sega's best-known character is Sonic. You probably think that Sonic's first appearance was in 1991's Sonic the Hedgehog. That's actually not completely correct, although it was Sonic's first full-fledged game. In reality, Sonic first made an appearance in the arcade game Rad Mobile. Sega knew that they had to come up with a solid mascot to fight Mario, and they went through a variety of iterations before arriving at Sonic. This included a dog, an armadillo, a Theodore Roosevelt lookalike, a rabbit, and more. Sonic was designed to be fast, snarky, and have an attitude. This was intentional, as Sonic was supposed to set up a contrast with Mario. 2 celebrities that had quite the influence on Sonic? Well, they may surprise you. His boots? Those were inspired by the boots that Michael Jackson wore in the music video Bad. His can-do attitude? That apparently came from the governor of Arkansas in 1991, a guy named Bill Clinton. Let's all be grateful Sonic never had an intern. Sonic, of course, would become Sega's mascot, replacing Alex Kidd. Kidd was a star of numerous platforming games, including Alex Kidd in Miracle World, The Lost Stars, High Tech World, and more. 3 men were responsible for the creation of Sonic: Yuji Naka, Naoto Oshima, and Hirokazu Yashura. So, what are these 3 men up to today? Well, things aren't going so great for Yuji Naka. While he would have an illustrious career for Sega, creating numerous games, including more Sonic features and Virtua Fighter, Naka was arrested by Japanese authorities in 2022 for insider trading. Naka pled guilty, was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, and fined 172.5 million yen. By the way, that's not the only major criminal run for Sega-related actors. Pierre Taki, star of Judgment, a Yakuza spin-off, was arrested in 2019 on cocaine-related charges. Taki was sentenced to 18 months of jail and replaced as the voice of Olaf in the Japanese version of Frozen. The game was withdrawn from the Japanese market, and Taki was replaced by another actor. For the release of Sonic 2, video games never actually had a set release date, instead having a month or a season at most. Sonic 2 took a different tack, releasing on November 24th, 1992, or Sonic Tuesday in America. The next game in the series, Sonic 3, was supposed to be isometric. However, the technology wasn't yet ready to support that game, and Sonic 3 was instead developed in the traditional side-scrolling style. However, the game being developed would be used as Sonic 3D Blast. Sonic's success started with the plan of Tom Kalinske, Sega of America president, starting in mid-1990. Kalinske wanted to cut the price of the system, create games specific to the American audience, accelerate the advertising campaign of the system, and elevate Sonic by having him replace Altered Beast as the pack-in game. Initially, Kalinsky's plan was disapproved of by Sega's board of directors. However, Hayao Nakayama, president of Japan of Sega, approved the plan, telling Kalinsky, quote, "I hired you to make decisions for Europe and the Americans, so go ahead and do it." It would not be Kalinsky's last run-in with Sega's board of directors. Sega's success also came due to their willingness to create edgier, more mature games. This included gory versions of Mortal Kombat and the relatively violent Night Trap, which was really more like a B-movie level of violence. Of course, these controversies helped move the system. More on that later. Partially as a way of mitigating these controversies, probably as a way of milking it, Sega introduced the Video Game Rating Council, which was meant to help parents determine the appropriateness of Sega games. The system had 3 ratings: GA, appropriate for all audiences, MA13, parental discretion advised, and MA17, not appropriate for minors. The system would serve as a precursor for the ESRB, or Entertainment Software Ratings Board. Kalinske would serve as president of Sega of America until September 1996, when he felt that he lost the support and confidence of Sega's board. Kalinske would later turn to educational toys, serving as president of Leapfrog, an educational toy business, and then becoming president of the Knowledge Universe. Incidentally, and this is delightfully random, Tom Kalinske has a Twitter account. The account hasn't been updated since 2023, and its last tweets were a series of political ones, indicating Kalinsky's support for President Biden and opposition to former President Trump. Back to the systems. The Sega Genesis sold 30.75 million units, but Super Nintendo sold more, selling 49.1 million units. The rivalry between Sega and Nintendo was infamous and formed the basis of the console wars of the 90s. This rivalry snuck its way into many games. For example, there was Troubleshooter, a scrolling shooter game. With the right combo of buttons at the startup screen, players could see the character Mania stomping on a Super Nintendo. Other Sega Easter eggs were creepier. On Sega CD, with the right button combo during the sound test, you'd get this clip. The message translates to Infinite Fun, Sega Enterprise Mazin Picture. Mazin Picture refers to Masayoto Nishimura, an artist on the game who provided the voice of Sonic during a few of Sonic's one-liners. Much of Sega's success was due to the Sega Does What Nintendo Don't campaign, which continued the system's reliance on celebrity endorsers in games. This included Michael Jackson, boxer Buster Douglas, NBA coach Pat Riley, quarterback Joe Montana, and more. Let's talk about Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker was a beat-em-up game where you play as Michael Jackson. Your job? Find missing children. Oh. That wasn't the only music-related video game. There was also Revolution X, starring Aerosmith, in which you have to rescue Aerosmith from the clutches of the evil New Order Nation, which has banned music. Sega also relied, rather infamously, on blast processing, a term that referred to a graphics technique that was pretty much never used in the system. However, that's not to say that the Genesis didn't have real advantages over the Super Nintendo. The Genesis did have higher processing capabilities and could display more sprites on the screen. Sega was ahead of its time in a variety of ways, including its accessories. That included the Sega Activator, which was a full-body control pad that was meant to operate like the Kinect. It only worked on a few games, including Championship Karate, Eternal Champions, Greatest Heavyweights, and Streets of Rage 3. As you can imagine, there were a few issues with how the Activator operated. Sega is largely responsible for breaking Nintendo's monopoly on third-party developers. Prior to Sega, third-party developers were locked into relatively exclusive contracts with Nintendo, which came with rather draconian limits on how many games could be produced and sales agreements that unquestionably favored the video game giant. Despite the bad terms, it made sense for developers who had no option other than Nintendo. However, Sega aggressively courted third-party developers, including with promos that gave away third-party games. Ultimately, Sega was able to prove its viability and win over a variety of third-party developers, including Electronic Arts and Acclaim. Unfortunately, Sega's 3 systems after the Genesis, the Sega CD, 32X, and Game Gear, were not as successful. The Sega CD sold 2.24 million units, the 32X about 800,000 units, and the Game Gear about 10.8 million units. All of these systems either failed to meet sales estimates or couldn't compete with their Nintendo counterparts. Did the failure of these systems drive Sega's business elsewhere? Well, maybe. In addition to the arcades, Sega opened a chain of indoor theme parks known as Joyopolis. They are still active in Japan and China, with 22 parks currently open. Sega, like most console developers, had a series of aborted consoles. That included the Sega Neptune. The Neptune was a merged copy of the Genesis and 32X. The system itself was never sold commercially because the prototype became available at the same time as the Sega Saturn, which obviously got precedence. Also, did you know that Sega developed a sequel to the Game Gear? Kind of. The Sega Nomad was a handheld Genesis that was sold between 1995 and 1999. It could play Genesis games and was able to be plugged into a television. The system only sold 1 million copies and was Sega's last handheld device. Also, did you know that Sega is sort of responsible for selfies? The Sega Print Club was a publicly available machine in Japan that took pictures of users for a price while adding graphics and borders. They became a bit of a cultural phenomenon in the country during the 1990s and 2000s and likely influenced the development of the selfie. Of course, Sega had no shortage of other business failures. For example, a joint venture with Sony could have resulted in a new system and did result in joint investments in game development companies. However, Sega backed out of the joint system, with their board calling the partnership a quote, stupid idea and expressing doubt that Sony could keep up with the company. Yeah, good decision, guys. Anyway. Tom Kalinske also attempted to negotiate a deal with Silicon Graphics for a better graphics chip for the Saturn, but the deal was ultimately rejected by Sega of Japan. Silicon Graphics would ultimately produce chips for the Nintendo 64, which outsold the Saturn by a 4-to-1 margin. Sega also had a failed merger with Bandai, the toy manufacturer and video game developer. While the companies announced the intention to merge in 1997, staff objections at both companies scuttled the deal. However, the Sega Dreamcast did represent a successful partnership with the tech giant, Microsoft. Microsoft developed an operating system for the Dreamcast, and there were rumors at the time that Microsoft wanted to buy Sega. In many cases, Sega's problems with systems after the Genesis came down to a failure to work with third-party developers and produce a robust game library. For example, the 32X had a mere 40 games for the entire system, and many of those games were just remakes of already existing games. While the 32X and Sega CD failed, Sega was hoping to rebound with the Sega Saturn. For a time, that looked possible. In fact, when sold side by side against the PlayStation, at least at first, the Saturn was outperforming the PlayStation in Japan, although that success did not last. One of the reasons for the failure of the Saturn was its surprise launch. At E3 1995, the first ever E3, Tom Kalinske announced that the Saturn was available that day at select retail stores. This rush pissed off some retailers, undercut Sega's marketing efforts, and forced an incomplete game library to hit the market. Let's talk about those retailers for a second, because man were they angry. Walmart, Best Buy, and KB Toys didn't have the Saturn as part of the exclusive launch. Those stores responded to the snub by refusing to carry the system at all. Oops. Part of the reason for such an emphasis on the Saturn was because the system was meant to completely change the orientation of Sega. The Saturn was the first ever Sega system meant to display 3D graphics. However, the unique nature of the Saturn's graphical architecture meant that sprites were generated kind of weirdly, and that 2D sprites were essentially used to generate 3D space. This led to the occasional distorted graphic and meant that some analysts argued that the system wasn't truly 3D. One of the attempts at making a marquee game for the Saturn was the development of Sonic x-treme. It was a Sonic platformer with 3D gameplay and a fisheye lens that was meant to provide players with a unique perspective. It had a variety of revolutionary systems and mechanics and may have changed the success of the Saturn. The game development was troubled, plagued by internal conflicts and differences over the direction of the game. There was also regular conflict between Sega of America and Sega of Japan when it came to the game's development. The game did have a playable demo at 1996's E3, but the internal problems ultimately forced the game's cancellation. Of course, Sonic x-treme wasn't the only canceled Sonic game. Other examples included Sonic Mars, which started for the 32X. There was also Sega Sonic Brothers, a puzzle game, as well as Sonic 16, which was meant to appear in the same universe as a Sonic TV series. You can't blame the Saturn's failure on a small game library. The system had 1,025 total games. That being said, and this is important for Western listeners, 75% of those games were only released in Japan. Sega's next major console release was the Dreamcast, which came out in 1998 and 1999 across the world. It sold 9.3 million units before being pulled from production. Originally, the Dreamcast was called the Katana. The name Dreamcast was selected based on a public contest that examined 5,000 names. Dreamcast was a combination of the terms dream and broadcast, which likely refers to the advanced internet capabilities of the Dreamcast. Another interesting piece of Dreamcast lore is its logo, which was, according to Sega's president at the time, quote, meant to evoke the vastness of space or the unlimited potential of humans. Different regions had different colored logos. Japan's was orange, America's red, and Europe's blue. The Dreamcast took advantage of a unique format for its games. Instead of using the CD-ROM, it used the GD-ROM, or Gigabyte Disk Read-Only Memory. This was done to take advantage of greater storage opportunities and because the GD-ROM was thought to be harder to pirate. That wasn't the case at all. The Dreamcast had a functionality to play music via their MIL-CD format, and that allowed video game pirates to create copies of games. The Dreamcast may not have succeeded commercially, but it had a lot of features that were a first for many video game systems. For example, the Dreamcast was one of the first systems to have a built-in modem, allowing players to play online. It also had subscription-based online services that varied based on where players lived. This was called Drickus in Japan, SegaNet in the United States, Dream Arena in Europe, and Kama in Australia. Dozens of Dreamcast games had online features, including Quake 3, Star Lancer, and multiple sports games. These games allowed friends to play against each other or collaboratively. Other games had additional online features, including online leaderboards or DLC. Sega's final console was the Dreamcast, which failed to meet expectations and forced Sega out of the console business. Sega made it official with a January 31st announcement in which they said they would be ceasing production of the Dreamcast in March and shifting to third-party development. While the Dreamcast had its problems, price wasn't one of them. The system was $199 in 1999, which, even on an inflation-adjusted basis, makes this one of the cheapest major systems ever made. Sega's financial struggles during this time were well known. As noted by Sega Retro, these issues were caused, in large part, by a decline in export revenue, which fell off a cliff in 1994. From 1997 to 2002, Sega had 5 straight years of financial losses and began a round of workforce cuts around that time. So, how did Sega survive? In part by generosity. The company's chairman and president, Isao Okawa, forgave a $500 million loan he made to Sega. He also returned $695 million in stock. This generosity helped to save the company as it moved from a console developer to a third-party developer. In 2004, Sega became a subsidiary of Sega Sammy Holdings. Sega and Sammy, which produced pachinko games, were the business's 2 main holdings. Sega is still owned by Sega Sammy today. Since that time, Sega has aggressively purchased numerous game studios. This includes Rovio Entertainment, which produces the Angry Birds series, as well as 2 Point Studios, Amplitude Studios, and more. Before that merger, Sega almost went in a very different direction. The company was almost bought by Microsoft, repeatedly. As recently as 2020, emails show that Microsoft almost purchased Sega, thinking that the purchase would drive revenue for the Game Pass. In 2021, Microsoft still listed Sega as a key target for potential mergers. Keep in mind, this was the second time that such merger talk had been undertaken. In 2001, the companies worked together. Microsoft considered buying the company at that time, but passed as Bill Gates didn't think Sega could stop Sony. In the end, the companies announced a deal by which Sega would produce 11 games for Microsoft. While Sega's most popular series is Sonic, the system has produced so much more than that. For example, there's the Echo the Dolphin series, which features the eponymous dolphin fighting aliens? Let's talk about the name Echo. It was chosen as the dolphin's name because it roughly translates to I see in Japan and dolphin see via echolocation. Echo the Dolphin is a notoriously challenging game, and that was done by design. Game developer Ed Anuzada told the media that he intentionally made the game hard due to a fear of kids beating the game over the weekend while renting it. So, if you bought the game and wondered why it was so impossible, you have Blockbuster to blame. The best-selling Sega game that wasn't Sonic was Disney's Aladdin. That game was the 3rd best-selling Sega game ever and sold more than 4 million copies. The game also resulted in a first-of-its-kind marketing deal. Because of Disney's increased role in the production of the game, Virgin Interactive, the developer, negotiated a deal that allowed Sega to market and distribute the game, but receive more money in exchange. This deal not only turned a profit, but helped Sega increase their brand recognition. Keep in mind, this game premiered in 1993 and only had a budget of $250,000. That budget was personally approved by Jeffrey Katzenberg, chairman of Walt Disney Studios. Does the style of Aladdin seem unique? The game was the first ever to use hand-drawn animation. There was also supposed to be a sequel to this game. That game would have used pre-rendered graphics like those seen in Donkey Kong Country. However, Disney canceled that sequel. Speaking of pre-rendered graphics, do you remember Vector Man? The game, released in 1995, was one of Sega's first to use pre-rendered graphics. It was designed explicitly to compete against Donkey Kong Country. Now, obviously, you can't talk about the Genesis without talking about Mortal Kombat, the 5th best-selling game for the console. The Sega version was more violent than the Super Nintendo counterpart, but still required a cheat code to enable the full blood mode and fatalities. The cheat code was ABACABB, which was almost identical to the name of an album title by the rock band Genesis. Yes, Genesis. The original Mortal Kombat was a huge hit on the original Genesis, but it also appeared on the Sega CD, where improved graphics and controls made the game more faithful to the arcade version. The Sega CD version did not require a cheat code to unlock full blood and gore. As we all know, Sega was very technologically ahead of its time. For example, they had a really early version of Rock Band, or at least something approaching it. Air Drums was a game for the Genesis that was announced at Summer CES 1993, and it would have allowed players to play the drums using the Activator peripheral. It was ultimately canceled. Other Sega games that were canceled? Godfather 3? The game would have been based off of Godfather 3, a movie which was easily the least successful of the popular series. How would the game have worked? Yeah, sadly, no one knows. Sonic games weren't just limited to the core series. A popular Sega game was Sonic Spinball, which was the 15th best-selling game for the system, selling over 1 million copies. However, the game only premiered when Sega realized that Sonic 3 wasn't going to be ready for the 1993 holiday season. Desperate for a game to fill the void, Sonic Spinball was developed in a mere 9 months. Sonic Spinball also had some interesting spin-offs. For example, there was a sequel, Sonic Pinball Party. There was also a Sonic Spinball coaster created in 2010 at Alton Towers in England. Perhaps no game has achieved greater cult status for Sega than ToeJam and Earl, the game about these two things. In the original game, you have to collect pieces of their spaceship to get back to the planet of Funkatron. The game had multiple sequels, including a canceled one that would have featured more indoor areas and altered terrains. The game was successful enough that it ultimately resulted in a remake for the Wii. There is also apparently a movie coming out. The movie is in development with Amazon MGM Studios and Unanimous Media, the movie company of basketball star Stephen Curry. And now let's talk about Night Trap. This game follows the adventures of teenage girls having a sleepover at a house that is filled with vampires. It's terrible. It's basically a B movie. The violence in the game helped inspire congressional hearings on video game violence, which led to the creation of the ESRB. The controversy surrounding Night Trap was so serious that at least 2 retailers, Toys R Us and KB Toys, pulled the game, and Sega stopped making copies in 1994. Of course, as you can imagine, that cessation didn't last forever, and the game is now available on many different platforms. The development, production, and marketing of Night Trap, which was released in 1989, had a budget of $1.5 million. At the time, that made it the most expensive game ever made. Also, lest anyone think that the controversy hurt Night Trap, yeah, no. In the weeks following the congressional hearings on the game, it sold 50,000 copies. So, thanks Senator Lieberman? Night Trap isn't the only Sega game that inspired controversy or lawsuits. For example, there was Super Monaco GP, a racing game that featured billboards which actually looked like advertisements for Marlboro cigarettes. Unhappy with the unauthorized use of its image, Marlboro sued. A settlement was reached in which Sega advertised that they could sell conversion kits and pay owners of the game $200 for removing the ads via the conversion kits. Sega had its share of very odd games. For example, if you remember in the 1990s, commercial mascots were kind of popular, including that freaky-looking dot from 7-Up, Cool Spot. Cool Spot wound up being in a platformer that was featured on a few systems, including Sega. Then there was the canceled Penn and Teller game. This game featured 6 mini-games where you could mess around with other players, had party games, and drive a bus in a straight line for 8 hours. Am I making that up? I am not. Sadly, the game was never released as the developer Absolute Entertainment could not afford to distribute the game. Oh, and while Sega often advertised their price advantage against the Super Nintendo, that wasn't the case for all of their games. 2 Sega games, Phantasy Star and Virtual Racing, actually sold for $100. Since making the transition to a third-party developer, Sega has had extensive success. Besides Sonic, its most popular franchises include Puyo Puyo, which sold 25 million copies, as well as Total War and Megami Tensei, which sold 20 million and 15 million copies respectively. Another wildly popular Sega series is Yakuza, which tells the story of individuals involved with the Yakuza, or Japanese mafia. Naturally, some reporters have interviewed real members of the Yakuza for their reaction, and it actually comes off pretty well. For example, a 2010 Boing Boing article interviewed a Yakuza member who gave the game high marks for its realism across a variety of factors. Look, the Sega is a lot of things, but its history, efforts to innovate, and ability to briefly overtake the giant Nintendo are something of video game legend and to be celebrated. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.